Thank you very much. Anyway, a really terrific morning. I enjoyed this a lot. So I think we're looking at something quite different now. We just heard an incredible amount of elegant scientific research. What I'm going to be talking about is a very pragmatic approach to achieving carbon neutrality in California by 2045. And if you think about that, that's just 24 years from now. So California has ambitious goals. The plan is to get to carbon neutrality by 2045 and hopefully negative thereafter. There are interim goals along the way. By 2020, the goal is to get back to 1990 levels. By 2030, economy-wide 40% reduction in emissions. And if we look at the history from the year 2000 to just about now, we can see with the exception of the electricity sector, emissions have remained nearly constant, though there has been significant progress in the electricity sector. So we can definitely see our work is cut out for us. Okay, so let's look at the sources and uses of energy. So we have a variety of sources: solar, nuclear, hydro, wind, geothermal, but the two largest sources of energy in California are natural gas and petroleum. If we look at how these are utilized in the energy system for both residential and commercial, it's about 50-50 between natural gas for heating and hot water heating and electricity. In the industrial sector, dominated by natural gas, and the transportation sector still heavily dominated by petroleum. Whoops, yikes. Looks like there is some automatic controls on timing. Sorry about that. Anyway, so here are the emissions associated with all of these energy uses. They are spread out over the whole economy and just a myriad of many activities, but they can broadly be divided into a number of categories. Transportation emissions are the largest, about 41%. And that's divided between passenger vehicles and heavy duty vehicles and a small amount of other things. And then if we look at the next sector, oh goodness, is the industrial sector. And we can see that refineries are the single largest source of emissions, but also manufacturing is very significant, as well as things like cement and so forth. Moving on, we have electricity generation, about 15% of total emissions, and a significant fraction of that, nearly a third, are associated with our imports. The only fossil fuels in the California electricity system are natural gas, but we do import some coal and gas from out of state. Okay, so if we look at all of these emissions, we can see that there are some of them that we would classify as hard to eliminate or hard to abate. Those are included in industry, heavy duty transport in particular, providing reliable electricity. We need clean, firm power, and California currently relies on natural gas to provide that. Ag and livestock emissions are challenging, as well as things like shipping and aviation and cement. So if we add all of these up, that's about 90 million tons per year, or 20% of California's total emissions. Okay, so to deal with these hard to abate sectors, we're going to need some options for carbon dioxide removal. Here are some of the leading contenders. Those include forest preservation or reforestation, or even potentially afforestation, meaning planting trees where they haven't existed before, but in a water-strapped state like California, that's very challenging. There's also mineralization, where we can react atmospheric carbon dioxide with rocks containing magnesium and calcium, which will then form carbonates. There's direct air capture, basically putting industrial scrubbers where they can capture carbon dioxide from the air and then sequester that. There's bioenergy plus CCS, where we rely on the biological processes to capture the CO2, convert that to energy, and then store that CO2 for negative emissions. And we can also adjust agricultural practices to retain a greater amount of carbon in the soil. So these are the options for carbon dioxide removal. So as we think about the energy transition, and again, this very short time that we have available, there are many questions. These include, what are the lowest cost solutions for achieving carbon neutrality? We need to understand the impacts of electrification of transportation on heating, on demand for electricity. And that's not just the total demand, but it's how it's distributed over the course of a day and how it's distributed over the course of a year. And what about hydrogen? We just heard about the possibility for directly making hydrogen with solar energy. And how much do we need and what should be the role for that? And how do we achieve an equitable transition where everybody gets the benefit of cleaner transportation, cleaner air that can come along with the energy transition? And then finally, what is the right role for carbon dioxide removal and how much of this do we need? So to answer these questions, there's a new emerging field of inquiry that a number of young scholars around the world are developing called macroenergy systems modeling for the energy transition. I like to think of this as the science of the energy transition, where you can take information about energy demand for heating, transport, power, cooling, and so forth. We can get information about the weather, which also informs energy demand, but most importantly tells us about the availability of solar and wind resources. We need to understand the current grid configuration. We need to understand what all these cost. We can integrate all this through information, through models that allow us to identify lowest cost solutions, how the energy needs are going to shift during the transition, what would be those policies that would be most supportive? And finally, what is the value and need for new technologies? And we can also use these models to assess how uncertainty will guide our choices as we undergo all of these activities that will be needed. So I'm going to give you three vignettes or examples of a carbon neutral energy plan that uses this kind of macro energy systems modeling. I'll first talk about electricity decarbonization and electrification of transport and buildings. I'll then talk about CCS for industry and clean firm power, and finally wrap up with a discussion about hydrogen for heavy duty trucking. Okay, so the first story, carbon neutral electricity in California by 2045. I'm going to be discussing a study that was actually a collaboration between three groups. E3, leading California consulting company that works on energy transition issues. At Stanford, we run a model called ERBS, which is a tool that was developed at TU Munich with some collaborators there. And then finally, Princeton's Gen X model. And there's a brand new paper that summarizes this work that you might be interested, shown there. Okay, so I'm going to focus particularly on the results from our work, but I will say that the results were remarkably consistent across these three different modeling approaches, given that we took quite a different approach to temporal and spatial constraints and so forth on the models. So our model, again, that we used is ERBS, and it's what's called a capacity expansion and dispatch model. And what it provides is the lowest cost electricity generation mix and operating schedule that is guaranteed to meet the loads that we've required of it. So the inputs to these models are the existing power plant capacities, hourly demand for electricity over the course of an entire year, generation profiles from solar and wind resources, as well as hydro. And in addition to these inputs, we can give it policy constraints. So in California, we have a renewable portfolio standard that requires 60% renewable generation by 2030. We've already surpassed 30% in the state. We also impose emissions limits consistent with a 40% reduction in emissions by 2030, as well as the carbon neutrality by 2045. In our model, we have 14 different regions, 10 in the state, 4 outside to reflect the imports and exports. And then finally, we need a host of techno-economic parameters that basically describe the cost and performance constraints of the generation technologies, transmission, and so forth. So basically what the model does is it models the expansion or the new capacities that are needed for electricity generation, transmission, as well as energy storage. And the outputs are the costs, the new capacities needed, and the generating schedules. Okay, so I first want to talk about the issue of heating and vehicle electrification and what this means for the electricity loads in California. And we did a very detailed county by county study to look at how this would change over the course of this, over the area of the state. I'm just going to focus on one area. It's basically the San Francisco Bay Area, south down to around Monterey. One can think of this as a place with a relatively mild climate. And so this reflects the heating loads for a relatively mild region. So there are two panels here. One is the wintertime electricity demand. So the light pink is the existing demand and the red is the demand added by heating electrification. And the light blue is the energy required for vehicle electrification. In both of these, we assume a 90% penetration of electrification. So a very high degree of that. And you can see by 2045 that particularly during the winter, we nearly double demand for electricity due to the combination of both vehicle and heating electrification. And if we look at the summer, we can see that heating demand, of course, is going to be small. It's basically hot water, but the vehicle electrification adds significantly to demand there as well. So these are the new loads that we're going to be able to need to meet as we plan expansion of the system. Okay, just a little bit more about that here. So the net load in 2017 in California was 284 terawatts with a system peak of about 60 gigawatts. Looking out to 2030, we go up to 315 terawatt hours and increasing again, nearly double to 475 in 2045. And if we look at the peak, it goes from about 60 gigawatts now up to 94. So significant load growth is required. And from the panels on the right-hand side, this provides hourly and yearly information on what the new generating profiles will look like. And you can see the very significant demand growth between 2030 and 2045 to meet growing needs. Okay, so here we have some of the inputs that are required of the model. So these are the technology options and costs that are included. So we allow utility scale solar PV. We have a really excellent resource here in California. We also allow rooftop solar, though it basically doesn't get used unless we have a renewable only scenario. We have onshore wind. We have a modest and sort of modest quality onshore wind capability. We have a very good offshore wind capability, but it's deep water and requires floating turbines, which are technologically and economically much more challenging than onshore wind. A small amount of geothermal available in the state. We have lithium-ion batteries that we include for these particular runs. We used a 4-hour battery, though we've done a whole suite of studies. We also have what we call clean firm resources. So these are dispatchable resources that can be turned on when and where you want them. that have no emissions. So we model a natural gas combined cycle with 100% capture, essentially equivalent of the alum cycle that is well under development today. We include advanced nuclear, although California currently wouldn't allow expansion of nuclear with the existing policies. And we also include a zero carbon fuel that could be hydrogen. It could also be biogas. And if you note, the cost of these zero carbon fuels are very high relative to, for example, natural gas, reflecting our current understanding of what those costs would be. Okay, so let's talk about some results now. So I'm going to look at a variety of scenarios, and I'll describe what all these are so that it's a little bit clearer. And what we're going to do is we're going to compare them all to the reference case. So the reference case is we meet the full electricity demand that I've just described, but we don't constrain the emissions. Okay, we just say your only job is to make sure that we meet load. And under this case, very interestingly, we still see it's dominated by solar, meaning a testament to the very low cost of solar PV, and California is a very good resource. Also a significant amount of storage, which now plays the role of peaker plants. However, there is still about 29 gigawatts of natural gas left in the system. Okay, so we can compare this to some other scenarios. The second one is REB, that's renewables with batteries. And you can see if we're going to meet this with 100% renewable with the kind of resources available in California, we're going to need an extremely large system, more than double the size of the system that you would need without a carbon constraint. And again, dominated by solar and batteries. And here we see significant amount of rooftop solar as well. So moving over to the next scenario, this is renewables, batteries, and carbon capture and storage on natural gas plants. We can see that having about 25 gigawatts of clean firm power in the form of natural gas plus CCS significantly reduces the size of the overall system, but nevertheless that solar and batteries still dominate both the generating capacity as well as delivered power. Moving over to this scenario, this is renewables, batteries, and nuclear. We see that under the assumptions provided, nuclear was built in a rather big way. Overall system size is less than any of the other case, and solar is smaller in this case. Moving over here to renewables, batteries, and this zero carbon but relatively expensive fuel. We have a somewhat bigger system, again, largely dominated by solar and batteries. But nevertheless, even though it's expensive, there's still 19 gigawatts of this clean firm power. And then finally, we have the case where we give it everything. And under those circumstances, again, we see quite a small system, but again, still heavily reliant on solar and wind. Okay, so what's important here is, in addition to this generating mix, is to think about the costs. So, we're going to compare the cost to the reference case, which is where there were no constraints on carbon emissions. And if we look at the renewables and battery only, it's about 5 cents a kilowatt hour increases in the cost over the reference case. And if we look at all of the scenarios with clean firm power, what we see is the incremental cost is only about 1 to 2 cents a kilowatt hour. And again, enabled by this clean firm power shown here in the dashed blue box. So again, demonstrating how valuable it is to have some kind of dispatchable power. So in addition to giving us costs, these models also give us quite a bit of insight into why the system performs the way it does. And what I show here are the daily average generating profiles. So these are averaged over the course of the year for these different scenarios that we've been discussing. So we can see in the case of the renewables, batteries, and nuclear, the system really wants to use nuclear largely at night. it's actually operating more like a baseload power, and solar is basically added in the middle of the day. A significant amount of that is also stored to be used at night for peaking. If we compare that to the renewables, batteries, and carbon capture and storage, again, we see it wants to use a lot more solar, basically a lot in the middle of the day. It's storing a lot of solar in the middle of the day that's used both at, for the evening peak, as well as throughout the course of the night. But very importantly, it really wants to use the carbon capture and storage at night to be able to provide that nighttime power, because we don't have really good renewables at night. And this is compared to the case where we've got renewables and batteries only. You can see an enormous amount of solar generation, very large amount of storage, which basically has to be used throughout the course of the entire year to meet the full demand. This creates a lot of challenges. The system ends up being overbuilt, and there's a lot of curtailment in the system that's described here. So that gives us insights. But what we can see is that the more clean firm power we have, the closer our load profile is going to correspond to our generating profile. So it reduces the demand for energy storage, which again can be costly. So moving on to one other idea. So having clean firm power is very beneficial, but the question is do you need more than one type of clean firm power? And what our studies showed is that the more types of clean firm power you have, the smaller your system can be, the more efficiently it can operate, and the more cost effective it is. And that's because each technology can sort of find its own ideal operating niche. So it operates at a very high capacity factor over the course of the year. So it's a very economically efficient utilization of an asset that you had to buy. And that's sort of illustrated here. So again, this is over the course of the year, the hour of the day, and this is how it wants to operate nuclear if nuclear is the only clean firm power available. Similarly with CCS, here's our zero carbon fuel, again, really acting like a peaker and also a backstop in the time when other renewables aren't available. But when we look at the scenario where we've got all of the clean firm power available, what we can see is that when the facilities are operating, they're operating at near full capacity. Again, much more economically attractive for the owners and operators of those facilities. Okay, now I want to talk about something slightly different. So what would happen if we left unabated gas in the system? You know, if we didn't put carbon capture on those plants, could we simply add direct air capture, for example, to the system and compensate or offset those emissions by directly capturing CO2 from the atmosphere and sequestering it? And we looked at a couple of cases. We looked at the case where direct air capture cost $200 a ton, and a second case where it cost $800 a ton. Okay, so one sort of a really reasonably optimistic scenario for cost, and another one basically what it would cost today. And very interestingly, what we found is that the incremental cost of a system that allowed unabated gas but includes direct air capture is on the same order as the other cases with clean firm power, meaning that incremental cost would be only 1 to 2 cents a kilowatt hour as compared to 5 cents a kilowatt hour for a renewables and battery only case. So how much carbon do we need to capture? In the case of $200 a ton, optimal would be about 17 million tons of CO2 per year. With higher costs, we would limit that to about 8 million tons, at 7 million tons a year. So anyway, I thought this was a very interesting result that may create some more flexibility and opportunities for clean power. All right, now I'm going to move on to the next topic. That is CCS for industry and clean firm power. And this study was a collaboration with the Energy Futures Initiative to do a deep dive in California on the potential role of carbon capture and storage for decarbonizing the energy system. So we looked at CO2 sources, particularly from industry, but also some of that clean, firm power that might be amenable for CO2 capture and storage. We looked at the potential for storing CO2 in the state. We did techno-economic analysis that particularly included the value of incentives like California's low carbon fuel standard and 45Q. We also did cash flow analysis for individual projects, and also took a look at the social equity and community benefits that would be provided with better air quality associated with putting capture units, particularly on the industrial units. Okay. So on to the industrial sources. We only considered those that were greater than 100,000 tons per year, in part because only those would be eligible for 45Q. They had to be operating, and for example, at the refineries, we didn't look at capturing every source, but we looked at capturing only those large sources. Okay, so if we look, there's about 31.8 million tons of CO2 that is capturable at 51 different facilities. Those are divided between hydrogen, combined heat and power, cement, refineries, and ethanol. And from the right-hand side, you can see they're broadly distributed sort of in two clusters, one in the northern part of the state and one in the southern part of the state. So with regard to the natural gas combined cycle plants, here's a map showing the locations of these. Some of them we identified as suitable candidates for retrofit. Those were basically combined cycle plants that were relatively new with no planned retirement that were greater than 250 megawatts, and again, would qualify for 45Q. So there were 25 of these with a total of 14 gigawatts of capacity. A little more than half what we think would be needed for clean firm power if it was provided from the natural gas plants, with capturable emissions of about 27.5 million tons per year. Okay, so there we go. Okay, so what about the storage resource in the state? There have been a number of studies that have looked at the geology and concluded that there are very abundant and high quality resources. We took these and applied additional screens, in particular, applying California's own requirements that are established through the low carbon fuel standard. We also developed a number of exclusion layers that included things like proximity to faults or active seismicity or regions of high population density, sensitive habitats or restricted lands. And so the pink region are all the areas that we've excluded for one reason or another, leaving behind the light green, the gray dots, the blue dots as prospective regions for CO2 storage. The bottom line is there's a large capacity, about 70 gigatons, which would be sufficiently large to store more than 60 million tons per year for more than 1,000 years. So very good, high quality resource, though largely concentrated in the Central Valley of the state. Okay, so then the question becomes, what kind of infrastructure would be required to support this? You can see the sources that we identified here, the little black dots on the map. And about 16 of those were co-located between the emission source and the storage site. And the rest of them we identified could be aggregated into 4 hubs where there would be gathering lines and CO2 transport pipelines that could bring the CO2 to central locations where it could be efficiently and effectively stored. So that shows the pipelines and what a network could look like for storing 60 million tons a year. Okay, so we also, I mentioned, did the techno-economic analysis. This is a cost curve for CO2 capture in the state. We looked at 2 particular incentives, the low carbon fuel standard. It's currently trading, credits are trading at about $200 a ton, but we decided to take a very conservative approach and said at the long run, maybe it's valued at about $100 a ton. We also applied the 45Q tax credit to each of these individual facilities and came up with a cost curve. And interestingly, we find that even with these incentives available today, 20 million tons of CO2 could be stored a year economically. The rest, the additional 40 million tons a year, would need additional incentives. And this is particularly relevant for the natural gas combined cycle plants, where the costs are somewhat higher and additional incentives would be needed, even though they are part of the lowest cost solution for California's carbon neutral electricity. All right, final topic. Hydrogen for heavy duty trucking. Okay, so heavy duty trucking has some special challenges that need to be addressed. And shown here is just one particular aspect of this. So if we take a heavy duty truck and with diesel powered, and if you look at the total fraction of the payload that is required just to store the diesel and have the engine, it's basically very small because the energy density of diesel is very high. If, on the other hand, we make this a battery electric vehicle, what we can see is nearly 1/3 of the payload would actually have to go into transporting the batteries. Okay, so this isn't very efficient. If, on the other hand, we had a hydrogen fuel cell, we can see that we only need maybe less than 10% of the payload to be able to accommodate the infrastructure that would transport the fuels. So this is just one of the reasons that fuel cells are interesting. Also important because charging times are not necessarily compatible with, or EVs aren't compatible with how trucks are used today. So we decided to take a look at how much hydrogen might be required for the state of California. And we looked at all heavy duty trucking. So that includes heavy, as well as buses, motor coaches, and light heavy duty and so forth. Anyway, so we looked at the whole thing. If that entire part, which is about 8.2% of California's CO2 emissions, were converted to hydrogen, we'd need about 2.7 million tons a year of hydrogen. Of that, about 1/2 of that would be what we call the heavy duty. And that's probably where it's most suitable, though there's actually work going on to look at, for example, buses. We're partnering with AC Transit to do a pilot test there. Anyway, so 2.7 million tons potentially needed. So we are already producing about 2 million tons a year of hydrogen, mostly for the refinery applications, though there are some other uses as well. So we've already shown that production of hydrogen at this scale is possible. So the question then becomes is how are we going to produce it? And there are a number of ways we can use electrolysis. We've heard about this today, or photoelectric catalysis. If we were going to do this with electricity to split water, we'd need about 130 terawatt hours per year to provide that 2.7 million tons. So to put this in perspective, California currently produces about 195 terawatt hours a year. So this would represent a huge increase in the amount of electricity that would be needed. So the alternative is to use steam methane reforming with CCS. Steam methane reforming is the technology that's used to produce most hydrogen in this, well, essentially all of the hydrogen in the state today. However, it doesn't use carbon capture and storage, so there are emissions associated with it. So we'd need to add CCS to SMR facilities or build new ones to do this. To get all this energy, that 2.7 million tons a year of hydrogen, we'd need 425 billion cubic feet of methane per year. And we currently consume about 2,000. So it's about 20% of our current natural gas use would need to be repurposed. So we then went on to look at costs. And so On the left-hand side, we have cost estimates of a centralized steam methane reforming facility with carbon capture and storage. And included are also all the costs for delivery to the station and distribution at the filling station. So that's about $8 per kilogram of hydrogen. If we look at the right-hand side, this is, we imagined distributed electrolysis facilities that could provide hydrogen, at filling stations. And we looked at a number of scenarios. We could purchase grid power, or we could use distributed generation. And very interestingly, we found that for the power prices in the Sacramento region, that it was actually cheaper just to use grid power. And we can go into a discussion of why that's true. But anyway, bottom line costs are about $12 a kilogram of hydrogen. So about $4 a kilogram more than the alternative. And again, we included all the prices up to, being able to fill a tank. All right, so again, is this good news? Is this bad news? California has relatively high fuel prices, perhaps the highest in the nation. So it makes the comparison somewhat easier, but hydrogen can be utilized much more efficiently than gasoline. The conversion efficiency is better. So it turns out that actually for heavy duty trucking, that the hydrogen production at scale from a SMR plus CCS facility could be quite cost competitive. On the other side, with the electrolysis, prices are still higher, but there's certainly room to decrease prices. And if we could find a way to efficiently utilize the low cost renewables that we have, that would be excellent. But the problem is they're just, only available a certain fraction of the day. And if you added battery storage, all of a sudden the costs go way up. So still work to do in terms of cost competitiveness. But overall, this looks quite encouraging and creates a new option for diversifying the sources of energy for transportation. Okay, so I said from the beginning, I would kind of give you an overview or a big picture look at how California can move along a pathway to carbon neutrality. We talked about electricity, 100% clean electricity in California is eminently doable. Having that 100% carbon-free power enables us to reduce the vast majority of emissions from buildings, as well as light-duty passenger vehicles. And also some degree of the heavy duty, though a certain fraction of the heavy duty may be best served by hydrogen. And again, the costs don't look so out of reach based on the analysis that we showed. And then for some of the industrial sources, the hard to eliminate sources, carbon capture and storage can play an important role. And California has got very good resources for that. So I just want to end with one final thought that, if we're going to succeed in this energy transition, we're going to need economy-wide solutions that work for everyone. And the idea that it has to be one size fits all, I think will box us in. So for example, even the state of California, it's got vastly different climates where there are very different requirements over the course of the year. And there are different preferences. Some people may prefer to have a hydrogen truck versus a battery electric vehicle. Yeah, and we need to think about people. What works for people? We need to start engaging more people to have this conversation, not in small groups, but with everybody. And again, we need to find something that works across the entire economy. If we make solutions too expensive, we will put a damper on industry and really run the risk that people will simply choose not to do those activities in California, and they'll move to other states or other countries that are more cost effective to operate in. And just finally, I'd like to thank my research team, in particular, EJ Bike did the electricity systems modeling work. Justin and worked on the fuel cell work, and Chloe on the heating electrification. Also Sarah Salzer, our managing director for the Stanford Carbon Removal Initiative, and then the rest of the Benson Lab team, and funding from a variety of sources. So thanks very much, and happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Sally. A lot of stuff going on there, and several questions have come up into the chat. And let me just see if I can do justice to some of them in the time available. Is there still considered a future in making liquid fuel for transportation from combining carbon capture with greenhouse gas-free energy sources? That's greenhouse gas-free energy sources. That's what that is.
Yeah, I think that, the way I think about it is that, we're just beginning on a radical transformation of our energy system. Some things are available now and that, are within reach, maybe a little bit too expensive, but we can do. Some things are still at the R&D stage. And I think that I'm so encouraged by the progress. For example, the last talk, Harry's talk about solar fuels and carbon reduction to make fuels, but I don't know that they're going to be ready before 2045. So I don't want to wait. I mean, and the other reality is at some point, fossil fuels are going to run out. The other thing is that if the demand for fossil fuels is not so great, the prices won't be so high. So the incentive to continue to discover more and more fossil fuels is going to go away. So, I do think we need to plan for a sort of century-long transition, but we can't wait, we can't even wait, 25 years. So to get to carbon neutrality. So we need to use the solutions that are in hand now, but recognizing that those might not necessarily be the final solutions. I think things like, nuclear power are, could contribute tremendously too. So I don't think we want to, limit our sights to just what's here now, but on the other hand, we can't wait for some of these things that aren't ready yet.
Yes, that's a really good point, is that you're focused on 2045 here. And so you're dealing with things that are available. I mean, you're including nuclear, which means that you believe it's practical to build more nuclear in the next 25 years, I guess. In the storage area, I noticed you're modeling only lithium-ion batteries, and of course other storage methods are coming on, like flow batteries with longer discharge duration power. Did you just exclude them because they're not big enough now, or did you model them and decide they don't really change the picture?
Right. Yeah. So we've modeled a lot of, we've done a lot of work with, basically hydrogen storage as well. So longer duration storage. And I just happen to focus on the ones with the 4 hours because it's a simpler story than the. So if you let the models kind of choose the optimal duration storage, unless it's sort of super cheap, it doesn't really like much more than, say, a 10-hour battery. It likes to do day nights. California's got such a strong solar resource. If we can get something that you can store enough energy to take you through the night, the models really like that. If you can get to really, really low cost, like geologic storage of hydrogen, that's produced, in a low cost way, it will like that. It'll start using seasonal storage if you give it that, but it really has to be very, very low cost storage. Yeah, lower cost and a very big scale so that you can really start doing the seasonal shift.
All right, let me read. We have time, I think, for one more, and there's a couple here. There's a long one, which I'll skip, but maybe during the break, Sally, you can address that. And there's a shorter one, which I think we can get in now. Regarding the capacity expansion models, I'm wondering if the land exclusions are absolute. For example, sometimes there can be co-occurrence of land uses or replacements as prior developments come to an end.
Mhm. Right. So we did not exclude any land for solar or wind or any of the only land exclusion we applied was for carbon capture and storage. And that was, basically, taking out sensitive habitats and so forth. Now, some of those lands, may be possible. And yes, you could have, multiple uses on the same piece of property. If you have a CO2 storage operation, it's actually very, very, it's not very disruptive. You basically have a well and some gauges and relatively modest amount of activity at a facility. So you could have some use, but anyway, we didn't limit solar or wind. On the other hand, we only put solar and wind where there was good land for it. I mean, it had to have a good resource. Like we didn't put a whole bunch of solar up north where, it's a lot cloudier and so forth.
Well, it's noon, and I think it's time for lunch for those of us here on the East Coast, and maybe coffee for those of you here on the West. We reconvene at 1:10. That's an hour and 10 minutes from now. And there is, if you can go to the chat, Sally, and deal with the one
Sure.
long we can get to, that we greatly appreciate it. And thanks so much. Thanks to our West Coast note speakers, especially for getting up early in order to join us on Eastern time this morning. Have a good lunch, and I'll see you in the afternoon.
Fantastic. Okay, so now is the lunchtime, but also feel free to actually stay around for a few minutes, Sally, if you like. I have a question, on the hydrogen price that you got. It's clear that the methane reforming plus the CCUS is cheaper than the water electrolysis. So I wonder, are there exceptions to that? In other words, are there actually scenarios where water electrolyzers could have a place in the marketplace?
If you have to transport it really long distances, there get to be some benefits. So maybe I'll just say a little bit about, so we were modeling, we actually took real the weather data on solar generation, and we actually tried to predict your daily hydrogen production from solar, from distributed solar, which would have very low cost, in which case that would be much more cost competitive. The problem is that it's just very low capacity factor utilization on the electrolyzer, number one. So all of a sudden it kind of triples the unit cost of the electrolyzer. The other thing is if you say, okay, well, I need to be able to deliver a certain amount of hydrogen 24 hours a day, all of a sudden then you have to start building a lot bigger storage facilities so that, you generate just during the middle of the day, and then you store it and you can use it over the course of the day. And then if you don't have power, if you don't have sun for 3 or 4 days or even a week or two, which can happen, you can't close your filling station. So there get to be a lot of practical problems. But I can imagine, again, certain areas and also areas that are not really co-located with, convenient transportation corridors where distributed, hydrogen will make sense. And I think there's still room to reduce the cost of, electrolyzers and so forth. So, I think it's too early to say that there's kind of, that these are the final answers. I think this is just the answer for now. Yeah, you know, and honestly, it might be a lot easier to build an electrolyzer than to be able to build a big, you know, SMR plus CCS facility. Like the permitting might be much easier on electrolyzer. So all those soft costs might actually be way cheaper for the electrolyzer. And at the end of the day, soft costs are really important, and time delays are
Mhm.
and social license to operate. So yeah.
So right now the CCS cost model is based on like what's the assumptions right now? So it's based on geological storage of CO2.
Right, it's based on geological storage of CO2, which again, in California, you know, there are very good options there. So in some places, it's also not going to work, right? You'd have to have a big pipeline to carry it away. So SMR costs, you know, are very well established. You know, CCS costs, you know, these are just using post-combustion capture. So it's not, you know, any fancy thing that's not known. So the costs, I think, are relatively well known. And yeah. So anyway, so I think Adam had a question about the disadvantageous charging profile we showed. Actually, I don't know if Adam, you're still there. Actually, in California, like all the load shifting, we actually want to shift it into the middle of the day, and we put it in the middle of the day because that was very advantageous, because that's when we've got all of our solar energy.
Right. Yeah, that's my question. I was wondering if there are some policy options that you are pursuing or could pursue to time shift those loads much more cheaply than batteries, things like real-time pricing or demand response
right. Yeah. You know, there's a lot of people like Lawrence Berkeley Lab. You know, there's a really great team working on that there. And California does have demand response programs, you know, that in essence, you know, correspond to load shifting. Yeah, so we've done studies using the same model to look at sort of what's the, you know, value of load shifting. And, you know, you can get like 10% cost reductions if you have something like, oh gosh, I don't know, maybe like 15% or so of the shiftable load, or 20% of the shiftable load. At some point, there's diminishing returns for shiftable loads. But when you first create that flexibility, you know, it's sort of a one-for-one benefit in terms of cost reduction. Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, it seems that as the vehicles become a larger share of the grid with a lot of flexibility and time, it seems like a potential future, potential for growth in the future.
Right. Yeah. I mean, a big worry, you know, is that, you know, all of this home-based charging, everybody's just plugging into the grid at night. And pretty much California's grid at night is a natural gas grid, as compared to the middle of the day, where it's, you know, really low carbon intensity during the middle of the day here now. Because we've got, what, 11 gigawatts of solar on the system. And maybe 11 out of, I don't know, 11 out of 25 or something. It's not unusual to have as solar. And then part of it, the remaining is hydro, and part of the remaining is wind and geothermal. So, yeah.
That's remarkable. Yeah, thanks very much. Nice presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, one comment I have is, yeah, Sally, you know, this is everything from a carbon emission point of view, but there are also other pollutants like heavy metals, like plastic. So if we think of an electric vehicle, there's really, you know, it's pretty mineral intensive, and there's also persistent organic waste. And I think California is probably not paying a lot of attention to these non-CO2 pollutants.
Right. Well, they pay a lot of attention to like criteria air pollutants. As a matter of fact, I would say that is like almost more important than CO2. I mean, CO2 is clearly important, but we have you know, the whole middle of the state is a big like non-attainment, you know, air quality zone. It's like a big bathtub there between the Sierra Nevada and the Coast Range. So it's very hard to do anything new that requires any kind of, you know, yeah, criteria pollutant emissions. You know, in terms of what you're saying about like the metals and all of that, yeah, I think that is really in the backseat. Yeah, though there's, you must know Redwood Materials, yeah?
Yes,
The
yes,
JB
yes,
Strubble's
yes.
company, yeah. So, you know, so a lot of us are quite excited about the recycling
But are they
activity.
going to build in California? I think that's the, I mean,
They build in Nevada.
Exactly. So I think there's a bit of a regional, you know, equity here, which is,
Yeah.
you know, California, you know, it promotes the electric vehicles, but maybe you should do a lot of recycling in California as well.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I think there could be a backlash.
Yeah, you know, I completely agree, you know, and I just think that to get the air quality permits from the you know, what they call it now, oh gosh, their pyro process, but they don't call it that anymore. They call it what, catalytic reduction or something. I don't know. And yeah, even though their air emissions are very low from that, yeah, I think that the prospect of having to get those permits in California would just really scare people away. Yeah, and it really needs to be dealt with, because the industry in California is just, you know, just so feels so beleaguered. You know, it's so hard to get anything done. Yeah. So, yeah. Anyway, well, I enjoyed the morning. I thought those were really interesting talks. So thanks for the opportunity to join you. Yeah, sorry. What had happened is there were automatic timings, because I'd actually did the voice recording that I sent to you guys, so you had a backup. And then somehow the timing didn't get removed. So it was just going so fast.
No, it's fine. I think it went really well. So
it was okay.
Putting the finishing touch on this very good morning session. I really appreciate it.
Okay, well, great. Okay, well, thank you.